Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad that you are here with me today, especially for this, which is the inaugural, the first video in what we're hoping will be a long-running pragmatic pastoring series of videos. If you're here for the first time, it may not be the first time you've come to the Congregation for Clergy programs we've done. Actually, this is an outgrowth of the Congregations for Clergy worship services that we offered during the pandemic. But now, as the pandemic is really seems to hopefully be abating a bit, we decided to shift our focus away from offering worship services to really offer you some pragmatic insights into how you can become a better pastor, a healthier pastor, and a pastor who's more effective in your leadership. These videos and the idea for this really have come out of my own career, my vocation now as a spiritual director and as a clergy coach and as a consultant with churches in helping them turn around, not just by giving them conceptual messages, but really trying to help pastors with the pragmatics of ministry. Now, I'm going to tell you how I got into this idea. It actually came out of when I was the pastor of Calvin Presbyterian Church in Zelienople, Pennsylvania. During that time, I also worked as a spiritual director and primarily with pastors. And slowly what I began to realize was a lot of the problems and struggles pastors were having of kind of where is God in the midst of this? What's God calling me to do? And why am I struggling so much? It didn't come out of their being abandoned by God or God being absent. It just came about because a lot of times pastors were making pragmatic mistakes or engaging in pragmatic ways that worked against their own ministry. And so what happened was, for a lot of pastors, not all, but for a lot, I slowly shifted from just spiritual direction to start working with them on how to craft a healthier way of leading that diminished conflict, that nurtured community, and that nurtured buy-in to whatever they were doing as pastors, and that helped them become more effective in everything they're doing. These insights that I would offer actually came out of what is now my 34-year career as a pastor. But specifically, they're rooted in my experiences over the course of those 34 years, starting as an associate pastor, but then also becoming a senior pastor and also doing a mission to a struggling church as being kind of their mission pastor. My experiences in turning around and growing those churches, but also in turning around and growing a nonprofit. I tend to be both spiritually minded and pragmatically oriented. It comes from something my father said a long time ago, which is the reason so many people fail is they think a lot about high concepts, but they don't think pragmatically. And that's my hope, is that through this series of pragmatic pastoring videos, we're going to help you develop skills that just make you more effective. And I want to start today with a topic that I'm just going to call emphasizing experience. Because this is an insight that I had years ago that I think made a difference in turning around churches, but also in growing churches, because I have experiences in growing churches, in a denomination, in a mainline church culture where almost 80% of our churches are in decline. And to me, it was captured perfectly by the experiences of three people. One is somebody named Rich, and he has become a very good friend of mine and just a wonderful person. I remember when Rich and his wife were joining Calvin Church, I asked him what made them decide on Calvin Church. And Rich looked at me and he said, Graham, I had given up on church. I had pretty much decided I'm not going to church anymore. He said, my wife and I, my wife was insistent that we go and find a church, not only for ourselves, but to raise our family. And everywhere we went, he said, there just was something there. He said it was either dry and boring, or he said it just didn't engage, it didn't capture. And he said he had told his wife, I'm done with church, I'm done. Well, her stepmother had suggested visiting Calvin Church, and his wife did come and visit, and she really liked it. And she suggested to her, Rich, why don't you just come one time, and if you don't like it, then we won't have to go back anywhere else. Rich said he came in really, really skeptical. But he said something happened in the service where he started having experiences. He said it just was a different experience. He said it was a service that engaged not just his mind, but everything else. And afterwards, he said he wanted to start coming back because he said every time he started to have experiences. I don't know that he articulated it as experiences of God, but I think he would say that now. Or I think of another, Rachel, who just told me last week about her experience in joining the church. She said that when she came to the church, she said she was just visiting because she was dissatisfied with her own church. And she said she came there and through the music, and she said through the prayers, but also the art we had in the sanctuary. And fortunately, she also said the sermon by me, but she said she had some kind of an experience there that was just different from her experience in other churches. And it got her to want to become part of that church. Or I think about another experience somebody had. I'll call him John. I won't tell you what his real name is. John was a pastor in the area. And he had made the decision that not only was our church the wrong kind of church, but I was the wrong kind of pastor. And so one time he decided to come visit our church to really chronicle all that was wrong and heretical and bad about the service. He came in extremely skeptical. And I saw him at the service, and I was really glad that he was there and, wished him well, et cetera, et cetera. But I heard back through the grapevine afterwards from our executive presbyter, who said that this person had visited our church. And he said, I came in looking for what's wrong. And he said, that was the most deeply moving spiritual experience I've ever had in a worship service. Now, I would love to be able to tell you that he came in and said, Graham's sermon got me to see the light. But that's not what he said. He said the service was the most deeply moving spiritual experience he had had in worship. All three of them reflected an insight I gained years ago that changed the way and changed the focus of my leadership in the church. They reflected an insight I got from studying the great spiritual writers of Christianity and the great spiritual figures of Christianity, which is this, the insight. Nobody becomes a Christian because it makes sense, or because it gets them into heaven, or because it's quote unquote the right thing to do. Nobody who becomes a really deeply Christian does it for those reasons. Soren Kierkegaard talked about it almost 2 centuries ago, where he said, if you show me a Christian who says, I'm a Christian because I read the Bible and it makes sense and then I wanted to be a Christian, he said, I'll show you someone who's never been a Christian. He said, the really deep Christian, the true Christian, is the one who has come into the church, come into Christianity and despite what seems like the absurdity of it all, has an experience that leads them to leap across the abyss of the absurd into the arms of God. And that's a very loose paraphrasing of what Kierkegaard said. But if I read to you what Kierkegaard actually said, you would have clicked off this video about 25 seconds ago. It's the experience that causes us to convert. It's the experience that causes us to follow God. Think about your own life. What is it that led you into ministry? What is it that led you to seminary? It wasn't the rationality of it. Probably wasn't even the liturgy of it. It was that you were having some kind of experience that drove you to want to go deeper and further. It's the experience of most of the great Christians throughout history who were transforming. I think about Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who was this dynamic captain warrior whose leg was shattered by a cannonball. And in his 16-month convalescence while studying scripture and reading, he experienced God. Or St. Francis of Assisi, who was a partier, a gadfly, just somebody who was really much more interested in gambling and women and cars and not cars, but cards and drinking. And who during a battle between two principalities was captured and put into a dungeon for 9 months, a damp dungeon where he was abused, and yet where he also experienced God that led him to strip himself of everything, and to go into the mountains, to rebuild a chapel, and to lead others to the experience of God. I think about St. Patrick of Ireland, who was a slave for 9 years living outside, and he experienced God in the sun and the moon and the grass and the weather and the sheep and everything else. Or Martin Luther, who grappled with where God was, and it led him to incredible insights as he read Paul. Or John Wesley, who had such deep experiences of God, it led him to create a method for helping others to experience God. Or Millard Fuller, who became a millionaire at 29 and almost lost his family, which led him to sell all, give to the poor, and follow God, and eventually develop Habitat for Humanity. These are figures throughout Christian history that did what they did because of their experience of God, not because of rational thinking, and not because of the grandness or greatness of our liturgy or our practices. Nobody becomes a Christian because it makes sense. They become a Christian because they experience something other that leads them forward. And that's the realization I had for leading a church. See, in the modern church, we're trained to teach the right teachings, to teach the right doctrines, to teach orthodoxy, or the right practices, orthopraxy, to teach the right way of doing liturgy, the right way of doing church. We are full of teachings and beliefs about mission and how people should be engaged in ministry and mission because that's what God's calling them to do, because that's a good thing to do. The insight that I gained was to change the question. What beliefs do I need to teach them? What creeds do they need to know? What practices do they need to engage in? What mission or ministry should they be involved in? I changed all of that in my mind to ask a simple question. When people are engaged in this church, what are they experiencing? Are they experiencing God, or are they experiencing something else? It changed the way I looked at church and how to lead a church. My training had been towards getting people to think and do in particular ways. What these people taught me was that I am trying to lead a community that opens people to the experience of God in everything, through everything. And as I looked around, I realized this is what a significant difference is between the mainline church and Pentecostals and many of the non-denominational evangelicals. We don't like what they do because we see so much of what they do as being a performance. And I think I would agree with you. In many cases, what I see does not feel genuine or authentic, but it feels like a performance meant to try to get people to come here. But what performances offer that we don't is experiences. We don't ask at all what people's experiences are. Whereas those churches are constantly asking, are they experiencing Christ? Are they experiencing the Holy Spirit? I may not like what they do, but I can see what it is that they are doing. And often case why they may grow in many ways and we don't. This insight changed the way I did ministry. I began to ask all over the place, what are people's experiences? Are we creating experiences of God, not only in the church, but through others, through our practices, through all the things we do? And it really began in two places, worship and meetings. I began to ask the question, what do people experience when they worship here at Calvin Church? Are they experiencing God or just Presbyterian worship? And we began to change things based on trying to nurture experiences in a lot of ways. We made our worship services less wordy because wordiness doesn't lead to necessarily godliness. And if you look at most of our bulletins, we're just filled with words, but I realize people experience God through music, through art, through laughter, through performance, through all of these things. So we began to change our worship services, letting go of things like calls to worship and moving more things like Taizé prayer in, or quiet prayer, or prayers that are written in a more conversational way, bringing in more music, but not just music that's typical sacred music, but music that's from all over the place, whether it's traditional hymns, or whether it's praise music, or blues, or jazz, or just meditative music, or something else. And we began to put art all around our worships, all around our sanctuary, recognizing that it's also what people see that touches them, the experience of God. And we used to do things like we made it so that when you walked into our sanctuary, before worship, we had meditative music. So we're setting a context so that when people, even before worship starts, they're having an experience. But we did the same thing with our meetings. We realized our meetings are very functional. There's not much of a difference between a school board meeting, a corporation meeting, and a church meeting. In most of them, they push the experience of God away. And so we changed, and I've written about this in Becoming a Blessed Church and have resources all over the place. But we really changed the way we did our meetings, where we begin our meetings with a half an hour, 40 minutes of prayer and study. And usually when I teach this stuff, people go, how long do your meetings go? I said, well, about the same as your meetings, because we cut out things like reports and just that functional, mundane stuff that actually leads people to a bored experience. We got rid of the stuff that's boring. We put in more study, but we also emphasize God is speaking to us through each other. And it shaped the way we created classes and small groups. The way we emphasize ministry and mission, where it's not, this would be good to do, but more, this is something where you'll experience God and help other people experience God. But it also made me realize everything we do in the church is about experience. Coffee hour after church, greeting people when they walk in, having celebrations, having just conversations, all of that stuff are experiences. And the question is, can I lead in a way that shapes a community of experiences of God, where we're seeing everything that we do as potentially an experience of God, rather than just doing the right things or thinking the right way? So what I'm going to ask you to do this week is I want you to sit down and pray and reflect and think on both A, Are you leading people to experiences of God, or are you leading them to other kinds of experiences? So I want you this week to take all this stuff that I've talked about, and I want you to just break it down. Worship. What are people experiencing? And I don't just mean the people who are in your worship service, but I mean look at it from the perspective of visitors. Are they coming into your worship service and experiencing God? Are kids, younger people experiencing God? Are people who are in the middle of adulthood, are they experiencing God? Because sometimes we just focus on one class of people who only want worship to be one way. But the question is everybody experiencing God? And start asking the same thing about classes. And if you have groups, groups. And if you don't have groups, can we set up groups that are experiential, that are reading about experiences, but also experiential? Take all these things I've talked about and put them into these categories and ask, what are people experiencing? Are they experiencing God or something else? And then once you've done that, the second thing, I want you to start becoming intentional in your leadership about nurturing a community of experience, of asking the question not only of yourself, but start asking it of others. Are people in our church experiencing God? Can we set up a focus group to find out what people are experiencing, and then ask, how do we become more intentional about making everything we do something that nurtures the experience of God, not only above all, but in all and through all. Thank you so much for this time, and my blessings on you and my prayers for you as you do leadership in your ministry and in your life. Amen.